Welcome to Mining Over Canada. Join the Canadian Securities Exchange and our partners in a first-hand look into our country's vast mining landscape.
Welcome, everybody, to another special edition of the CSE. This time, we're bringing to you Mining Over Canada. It's our latest initiative to encourage everybody to learn more about the mining sector in Canada. We've been talking to different publicly traded companies on the CSE. We've been talking to different associations, individuals that are helping grow this industry. And today, I have the pleasure of sitting down and talking to Mr. Peter Johnston. Peter Johnston is the Grand Chief of the Council of the Yukon First Nations. Welcome, Peter, to this edition of Mining Over Canada. This week, we're featuring the Northern Territories, and welcome again. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, Chish, Yaketu we say good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Of course. So, Peter, why don't we begin by you just giving us a brief intro to who you are and what your role is?
Yes, my name is Peter Johnston. Obviously, I'm a father of four, born and raised Yukoner. I'm a member of the Teslin Tlingit Council, which is one of the 14 nations that are located here in the territory. I lived in a small community of Teslin for majority of my life and spent, a lot of great years there, not only as a young person, but working for my First Nation also. So I spent 12 years in Teslin Tlingit Council as a government and in the highest position as chief as well. And it's been such an incredible process, let alone the career that I've been able to, been so fortunate to have, because when we give back to our communities and have that ability to have, the right to self-determination through land claim and self-government agreements, let alone to see the community develop through these agreements, it's such a pleasure to see and be involved in such a great process. So now in my role as the Grand Chief, I've been here, I've spent one term and I'm on my second term right now. And it's been such a pleasure to uphold the legacy of the Council of Yukon First Nations. As an organization that's almost 50 years old, my father was one of the founding chiefs back in Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. So I hold a lot of that obligation and responsibility as a young person, and continue to hold up that legacy and honor today as in my role as the Grand Chief. So as much as it is, taxing sometimes in the political world, I feel the motivation every day to get up in order to create a better world for our people going forward, but more importantly for Yukoners in general. So,
of course, I appreciate you taking the time to give us that little introduction to what you do. Let's talk a little bit about the history. Now that you mentioned that, let's talk about the history of the Yukon First Nations.
Well, we're pretty lucky where we're located in Canada. Obviously, in northern Canada and the far, northwest, if you will. If you go back in the course of our history, over even in the last 100 years, the temperatures here in the territory, let alone the rugged terrain, have always been kind of what kept people away, if you will. And it wasn't until like the mid 1800s, late 1870s or so, we started to get an influx of explorers coming into the territory that we're now mapping the way, if you will, not only for future exploration, but also, this is the process they use to identify rivers and creeks and streams and pretty well map out the north. So we've been, impacted, if you will, since about the 1870s, if you will, and especially with the influx of, just the missionaries, the churches coming into our territory, let alone, like I said, RCMP, and then in 1896, obviously with the gold rush and the finding of gold in Dawson City, that really impacted our life and changed our life here in the territory forever at the end of the day. So I can get into some of that detail just in regards to what happened, just during that whole gold rush, we had an influx of 30 to 40,000 people come into Dawson City, which is the Trondeck Gwich'in's traditional territory. So the chief at the time, Chief Isaac, was very much seeing the impacts of his people, the devastation of the land, the devastation of the wildlife, and their ways of doing and being as traditional people of the land. So he relocated his nation downriver about 3 miles from Dawson City. So meanwhile, at the same time, the gold rush is happening in full swing. There's a lot of different changes happening to the community, let alone to the land itself. And really, at the end of the day, there was not a lot of gold being found, unfortunately, for these people that have traveled as far as California. So, but however, during that whole process from coming, whether it was into Skagway, which we know as traditionally as Dai, or at the head of Teslin Lake, there was many different places where the gold seekers had traveled through and impacted our traditional areas. So where I'm from, in Teslin there, we have one of the longest lakes in this region, which is about 89 miles long. So the gold seekers were coming through and they found the head of the lake, and pretty well you can navigate from Teslin Lake at the head of the headwaters all the way to Dawson City by water. So it was obviously very, it was a really good way to travel, if you will, because you're not going through the treacherous lands anymore. And the water itself does obviously hold its own obstacles. And I know for one story in particular, there's a place called Slaughterhouse in our traditional territory. So a fella brought up about 750 head of cattle that was heading north to Dawson, obviously to feed and to provide for all the gold seekers. So he slaughtered the cattle there in our traditional territory and put them on barges and taken this meat to Dawson because he thought he was very close by that point. And all of a sudden there's one big wave and impact happened, and it flipped that barge, and he lost all his cattle to the water. So there's many different stories along the way just based on impacts. Pretty well you had people, particularly in Dawson or in Skagway, that were bringing pianos and all this not normal stuff to the north, if you will, that brought that created the Dawson City folklore, if you will. So pianos and dancing girls and wealth, all this wealth was coming, but nobody at the end of the day, like I said, really found fame and fortune. Only a few did, and that is the legacy that's been left in Dawson City, and probably the biggest community in our north, I should say, that's still impacted today by mining. So
that's a great opener to the history of the Yukon. Obviously, the terrain is quite treacherous out there, especially in those days, in the early days when people were coming out there to prospect and explore. So I appreciate you sharing that little piece of history, I should say, with us. So let's talk about the present day. I mean, what better place to start than what we're all going through right now, COVID? How's that, or has that affected you guys in your community right now?
Well, when the announcement came, when we had a pretty well emergency shutdown here in the territory, there was a lot of different factors that were put in place. Obviously, with the upcoming tourist season, let alone the mining season, we had to look at how we were going to not only minimize the impact, but try to still encourage some development, along with the biggest concern obviously was the health and safety of our communities, particularly our elders that were the most vulnerable. So a lot of the communities that host the mining activity do have, populations that are local and have been here for tens of thousands of years, for that matter. So there was a lot of discussion between government, particularly the government of the Yukon, and the First Nation governments that have, like I said, mining practices in their backyard in their traditional territory. So after we satisfied a lot of the concerns that we had, especially when it comes to that 14-day quarantine and how people were going to transfer from the south, if you will, that normally worked in, whether it was Victoria Gold or other mining properties in the north, that there had to be very strict rules and guidelines that the companies had to follow. And I think really at the end of the day, they've done a great job in not only upholding their responsibility as companies, but equally as important, ensuring that the safety of their staff, let alone the communities that they operate in, were at the first and foremost of their thinking. So, I don't think there has been any recorded cases. We've only had 17 in the north to date. So I don't believe any of those have been the result of mining activities or people coming into the territory to do so. So from that aspect, I think we've done a very good job in not only, like I said, upholding that responsibility for community safety, but at the same time, developing a process that each company could adhere to and be responsible for. So,
yeah, and have sort of set standards for everybody.
Yes, that's right.
A lot of people watching might not be familiar with the communities up there. So can you maybe talk to us on how big the First Nation communities are in the Northern Territories?
For sure. And, prior to contact, if you will, and I can give you a history lesson on that if you wish, but,
You love history.
I live history, and I mean, unfortunately, it takes such a long time, right? That's the only problem with history. It takes forever. But, with the influx of churches, let alone the military back in the 40s when they were building the Alaska Highway, it brought a lot of sickness into our communities. So our communities were at one time very, heavily populated, if you will, but we lost a lot to disease, unfortunately, through the 40s there. So now when we look at the Yukon, we just peaked over 42,000 people. And so when you think about Dawson City back in 1896, 1897, 1898, when the gold rush was happening, it was the biggest city west of Winnipeg, based on the fact of the influx of population of 30 to 40,000 people. So today, like I said, we're still modestly around 42,000. The First Nation population represents about 24%. So when you look at it, we're still, a fairly healthy population. We are growing probably at a rate about 1% based on the national average. So we're not as high a population maybe as Nunavut, that has a growth population, roughly about 3.5%. So a lot of young people are having babies in Nunavut. Here in the north, on this side of the planet, we definitely have an aging population and a lot of baby boomers, if you will, that are getting into our elderhood, if you will. So today, like I said, we represent about 24% of the population. However, with, outside of the community of Whitehorse, there's two distinct nations here in Whitehorse, the Kwalin First Nation and the Ta'an Nation. They are the urban First Nations here in the city of Whitehorse. And then once you reach out into the outside communities in the Yukon, which are roughly 12, there's some smaller incorporated communities, which we don't really mention as full communities, but there's 12 communities in the territory that are First Nation based primarily. Outside of Faro is one of the only communities that has a very minimal First Nation population. Other than that, when you talk about Haines Junction or Old Crow, or even small populations such as Burwash Landing, they're very much First Nation dominant. So my community of Teslin, we represent about 65% of the population. So, but what gives us that clout, obviously, not only as first peoples to the land and the first, we've been here for tens of thousands of years. We now have self-government that has been a reality in our communities for over 25 years. So we're very progressive. We're very, we now are building capital through proper investments for our First Nations. We are now providing employment opportunities to our community. So when the mining boom and bust cycle happens and the up and down of the mining cycle, self-government here in the territory is something that's very consistent in regards to providing employment. And through that government, now we're able to invest in businesses, which allows us to build capital, like I said, but also future prosperity for our nations. And, we're in the airline industry, we're Coca-Cola retailers. We own wineries in British Columbia, for instance. So we're really generating the wealth, but also with that, for instance, like Air North, it does provide jobs to people in Vancouver, Kelowna, Edmonton, Calgary, Victoria. So the influx of good business sense is now spread out to provide employment opportunities for the general public now. So it's been really good, a win-win situation, if you will. So.
Yeah, it's going both ways. It seems like it's obviously your own communities are being helped as well, but through that success and what you guys are building, you're able to provide for other communities as well. So it's not just all coming in. That's great. And mining is obviously a big part of your communities, especially
not for everyone though, not for everyone. And we really have to be cognizant of the fact that when you think about the activity, particularly in my traditional territory in Teslin, there's very minimal mining activity. We do have some silver claims, a little bit of molybdenum, but not a lot of. We haven't had a full-fledged mine for years, if you will. So we got to go back to the north, to Dawson City, to Mayo, Yukon, to Pelly Crossan, which is the Selkirk First Nation. Those three communities in particular, and then you got the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, which is a little bit south. Those four communities I should mention, let alone Ross River too, I guess. But are pretty well, if you go to the northeastern part of our territory, those are the most heavily impacted by mining activity. And those are the ones that have actually the operating mines as we speak today. When we look at Minto, like I said, Victoria Gold, there's a number of different examples of where the mining activity is happening currently right now.
So Peter, are you able to comment on how your communities benefit from working with some of these mining companies? Or
well, I guess
not specifically your community, but all the First Nations communities, how do they benefit from working with these mining companies?
Well, the obvious one is providing employment, right? And now that we're moving, a lot of these mines are moving into the second phase, if you will, of their project plan. So now they're growing from just building the mine to now operating in the mine. So, we're having upwards of, 300 to 800 people being needed for some of these developments that are happening. So the employment opportunities are very high, obviously, in some of these respective communities. And obviously, at the same time, it's drawing people from other parts of Canada, let alone other parts of the territory, to come and fulfill some of those needs and desires of the project. So we're seeing a lot of benefit from that employment opportunity. However, you go back to the boom and bust cycle, it does not help when the mining industry is down or the price of gold is down. So there is that lack of consistency happening in our employment, which does cause great concern to our people, because you get used to living a lifestyle, if you will, which allows you to have certain pleasures in life, such as paying your rent and getting groceries. And the cost of living here in the territory is quite considerably higher than other places. Just on the fact of bringing goods and services here to the north is not necessarily as easy as other jurisdictions. Secondly, some of the nations have developed really good impact benefit agreements, which now allows for them to have other benefits, which allows for community investment in some aspects, where the mining company now has an obligation to invest some of their own capital back into infrastructure in the communities. Maybe it's building youth centers or supporting other infrastructure projects in the community, such as recreation facilities. They're giving back to things such as Native Grad, which is something that we been honoring our graduates from the First Nations side for over 40 years. So in certain jurisdictions, mining companies are now giving supplements back to the graduates as a sense of, appreciation, if you will, for the work that they've done in their schooling. But it also provides them an opportunity for employment, obviously, as they graduate and move into their working lifestyle. So those two in particular are probably the biggest benefits. We're still living with a very old, outdated placer and quartz mining act here. So the royalties that we're getting back in that particular mining outlook is very meager and very actually disrespectful to the communities. However, we do have some good, when it comes to the hard rock mining, we definitely have some good agreements. There's one mine in particular, the Minto mine, which is located 100% on Settlement A, Category A lands in Selkirk First Nation, which when you talk about Category A, it is land that's owned by the First Nation directly. And with that, you're allowed to have surface and subsurface rights. So it allows for an added benefit. So with the Selkirk First Nation, I know particularly, which is public knowledge, the nation is getting about around $6 million a year in dividends that the mines kick back, along with when they first signed the agreement, every citizen that's over 21 and the ones that haven't reached 21 yet will all get a supplement of $15,000 too. So there was that signing bonus, if you will, that the mine has delivered. So there's different arrangements that are happening with different nations that are benefiting individuals in particular. So.
Well, I'm glad to see that, obviously there's still stuff that needs to be worked on, but you are seeing progress.
Yes, but however, we can get into the negative side really quickly, and how, why we've gotten into those positive arrangements is because, one, we have the jurisdiction now as self-governing nations that have land claim arrangements with, particularly with the federal and the territorial government, and which exercises not only our constitutional rights as Indigenous people to this country, but also our subsistence and ways and doing of, living a traditional lifestyle. So we've, fought long and hard for 25 years to negotiate our agreements, which have certain, like I said, thresholds that resource development companies have to do. And, we're very fortunate to have a made in Yukon. We refer to it as Yukon Economic and Socio-economic Assessment Act, which is YESAA, which is another safeguard that we've been able to secure through our agreements. That is a made in Yukon process, which not only allows the public here in the territory, but more importantly, the respected First Nation traditional territories to have a voice in regards to development. Maybe it's even digging a ditch in the backyard of your traditional territory. The nations now have a voice to say yay or nay to that, and to describe impacts of how, such things as mining are not only affecting them, but equally as important, the impacts to the land, right? So we've been very fortunate, like I said, through these agreements to have this jurisdiction being honored through the Constitution of Canada, let alone through the spirit and intent of those agreements. So it's up to us, obviously, as First Nations here in the territory, but equally as important, again, it's up to government too to adhere to the responsibility that they have also.
Absolutely. So it obviously took a little while for you guys to come from that stage over to, having these agreements that are beneficial to the communities. Peter, what were some of the hurdles that you guys faced over that last little while to be able to get to the stage?
Well, part of the problem, very similar, when I always compare it to the big game outfitting, which we're very famous for big game outfitting, where you have the monster moose and the big sheep. When these outfitters do their concessions, as you will, they claim out these lands in our traditional territory, and they have equally as much right to those lands as we do as First Nations, because they've applied for it. Very similar to the mining community. You can sit in California and buy land claims, stake claims by your computer in the territory for a meager amount of dollar, and then you withhold these lands. And a lot of cases we find that the First Nations don't even have the same ability, if you will, when it comes to protection, let alone identifying these pockets of land. So now when they've claimed these lands or staked the claim on these lands, let alone the impact of these traditional territories, it pushes the nations out of these areas that maybe they've been for hundreds of years, where their great grandmothers picked berries here, or they've picked medicines here, or they've done spiritual practices here, or they've harvested moose or fish from these areas. Now that the mining company is in there, they've really impacted our ability not only to have a right to our traditional ways of doing and being, but now the impact of the grandma's berry patch now will never come back to that place where we've been treasuring for hundreds of years. So, these are still a lot of the concerns that we have today that we've brought forward to government for particularly over the last 25 years, but have been concerns ever since day one, really. And it goes really back to even, like I said, the gold rush here, the Klondike gold rush. All those concerns are still alive and vivid today, but the more that we can work towards with government to alleviate, let alone to minimize the impact. We've been very fortunate the last 4 years with the current government, the Liberal government here under Sandy Silver's leadership, who is the premier of our territory, who also is the MLA of Dawson, the Dawson region, which, like I said, is one of the most highly impacted mining communities in our north. We've been able to create a mining MOU, which has given us the ability now to have discussion on the impacts, but more importantly, to look at these substantive gaps in the legislation, like I said, when it comes to the Yukon Mining Act, let alone when it comes to the Placer and Quartz Mining Act as well. So we're really trying to improve on the practices and the processes. We've always struggled under the last government when I was chief in Teslin that, basically they were giving $50,000 to anyone that was they're giving $50,000 to mining companies to explore in the territory, let alone they weren't encouraging the nations to come visit the respective governments, the First Nation governments that had the jurisdiction in their traditional territories. So basically giving them $50,000 to have free access to the Yukon. And I believe I can't remember exactly what year it was, we had the biggest mining impact in the territories ever seen. And if you looked at all the claims that were being proposed, the whole territory was literally plugged full with outside influence, let alone people that wanted to explore in the territory. So,
wow. So Peter, how are these decisions made, and sort of like, when it comes to negotiating these deals and acts, treaties?
Well, importantly, they're supposed to be there with three levels of government. One, the federal side, because the federal does have some influence when it comes to. So if I go back a little bit, in 2002, basically, there's a devolution agreement signed between the Yukon government and the federal government to devolve their federal powers, if you will, to the Yukon territory. So in 2002, we signed an agreement in principle to allow this devolution process to happen. So basically, the Yukon government got a land claim for free. And basically that responsibility was given from the federal to the territorial. So in some aspects, that gives us that ability to have that direct conversation with the premier and his cabinet and his team. And we've had, like I said, over the last 4 years, a lot of progress being made because, based on not only campaign promises, but obviously the evident reality that we face of the rape and pillage of our lands that are still continuing to carry on today as they have for the last 100 years. So the more that we have that opportunity to have that dialogue, to be in the room with the same people, I look at the mineral roundup that happens every year in Vancouver as being a very good place to have not only important dialogue with industry, but equally as important to bring parties together, because I find that's probably one of the best one-stop shops for us as Yukon First Nations, to have that dialogue with industry, government, and the affected First Nations. So we've done some good work over the last couple of years at Roundup, and in 2017 we did do the official signing of the MOU, which allowed us to enter into these discussions. Prior to that, like I said, we've taken the Yukon government to court many times over their lack of process and responsibility to these agreements. We can look back to the Peel Watershed, and the Peel Plan as one of the biggest impacts to our to the territory, which really at the end of the day lost the election for the previous government, because even the public at that point, who had agreed to the Peel Plan, as we referred to it as, so they were going to save 80% of the Peel, some of the most pristine lands in the world that are left today. So the public, along with government and First Nations, all agreed that we would preserve 80% of the Peel and then allow 20% for development, whether it be oil and gas or mining activity. So we went through this whole treacherous process and rigorous process at the end of the day for only government to throw the plan out the window and go their own way, where they were going to allow 80% development and only 20% to be saved for, like I said, for next generations, if you will. So we, the impact of not only, and the voice of not only the First Nations, but the general public really proved to show that, regardless of what government, regardless of what industries here, the local people have a voice at the end of the day. And it was great to see that the Supreme Court of Canada honored that agreement. And so we've always had, even with that, they tried to push the mining regulations and give it back to Ottawa. And so when we talk about like YESAA, which is obviously the Canadian environmental process, they wanted us to refer back to that rather than look at YESAA, which is, like I said, a Made in Yukon process, which brings all these respective governments and parties together. They wanted to push the decision-making back to Ottawa, where you have a minister in Ottawa that makes a decision on the resource projects in the territory. So we're very lucky that we had a good result in the court case, and now we're back to, like I said, working on improving that process as well, because there's a lot of gaps in places where the assessment process here in the territory could really be beneficial to everybody involved. I think the timelines are a little bit something that we definitely have to work on when you have to review or reapply to the same project to do something extra work, if you will. It almost has to go through a whole same rigorous process again. So I know that there's been a lot of complaints and discussion on how we can improve that process for the benefits of everybody at the end of the day.
So of course, Peter, I represent the Canadian Securities Exchange. Obviously we've got about 170 or more junior mining companies listed on our exchange. How does one work to create more awareness for some of these issues that your communities are facing when it comes to, working between that triangle of government, corporations, and then obviously the First Nations groups?
Well, we've always, and I can go back to some of the challenges we face. So we've have our Minister of Natural Resources and Environment out pretty well promoting the Yukon, whether it's at PDAC or other global opportunities where they speak. They've spoken obviously to the Toronto Stock Exchange as examples. They're out there promoting that Yukon is a great place to invest. You know, this is where, you know, where some of the best activity could be found. But we've always come back to the point that we need to be at those tables too, promoting the rights of the First Nations that live here. Equally as important to take advantage of the opportunities that we have in the North, which includes building that partnership with the First Nation governments that do own, like I mentioned before, companies, and we do own entities that they need to be aware of. So when they're investing in the territory, that in these small communities that they're applying not only their, you know, the hiring practices, if you will, but also pushing to have such things as using our companies to, whether it's for expedition or whether they're going to seek food and beverages or whatever it may be, the goods and services, if you will, let alone the manpower for these, to ensure that they're well aware of the First Nations that do own companies and that are living there. So we did make a promise at the last roundup. Unfortunately, there probably is only going to be a virtual one this year, but 2020, we did make a commitment to have more discussion with the mining community from a First Nation perspective, not necessarily involving the Yukon government, but to build this network between the companies that are doing business in our backyard, and to have that, you know, that not only that commitment and understanding to where they're going and who they're dealing with, but start building that relationship face to face. And I think really at the end of the day, when we can move into that place of, you know, mutual respect and mutual understanding, you know, I think it's a win-win for both the industry along with the First Nation communities that are being impacted. So
that's great, Peter. I think you said it best there. You know, it's all about that mutual respect for
yes.
not only the environment, the communities also, and then everybody can flourish.
Yes. So in previous years, you know, when we look at Faro as one of the biggest impacts in our community, and there's still a lot of devastation happening to the land, the water, the impacts to those, you know, those tributaries are never going to come back to normal. You know, if you fly over Faro mines, it's devastating to see the impact of land, the pollution that's been left there. You know, Yukoners are still on the tab to pay that electric bill that they've left behind. So we have a lot of great examples, Mount Nansen, if you will, Clinton Creek, in our traditional areas where there's devastation left on those lands. So unfortunately, you got to pay a lot of money and a lot of time and energy, let alone the impacts to the environment, to learn those lessons. So we've been very cognizant of how we move ahead. There's still those rogue companies out there that think they're over and above everybody else, and they're going to do what their mining plan has and what the Mining Act allows. And unfortunately, we're hitting them head on with disputes, unfortunately, because of the fact that they're just doing what they wish and really not following process or protocol, if you will, when it comes to dealing with the respected nations. So we've been very cognizant, like I said, over the history of mining here and the impacts. And really, at the end of the day, we're not against that resource development. We want to see it. We want to have it. We want to be a part of it. But it has to be done on our terms as well, when it comes to not only in preserving or limiting the environmental impact, let alone moving into this place of using technology for what it's worth, you know, and if we're going into these pristine lands, how do we immobilize the project through maybe air traffic or other means of transportation to get into these pristine parts of our country? So, yeah, you know, to say it's all well and great here and please come to invest, we are very, you know, we've been, you know, I think there's a lack of trust with the mining industry, but just based on those bad examples.
Yeah, I was going to use the word cautious because, you know, you guys have obviously seen so much, and everybody knows, you know, that part of the world is beautiful and it's pristine country. It's got so much history, nature, all that good stuff. It's like you mentioned earlier, it's probably one of the last untouched places in the entire world. So
yes.
Obviously we've come a long way with technology and things like that when it comes to reclamation and making sure that the environment is left in the same way that when you came into it. What would you say you'd like to see changed when it comes to some of these negatives that you're seeing? Obviously, all of them, but
Yeah,
immediately we're able to implement a few things.
yeah, and I think, unfortunately, when I was in leadership in Teslin, we never really had as much activity. So I always had kind of a negative attitude towards mining because I could see the leftover impacts, if you will, that we've had in our territory. And really at the end of the day, you want to change the way we do things. But when you go and you're picking berries and all you can see is leftover mining samples or oil barrels or just stuff that have been there for 50, 60 years, it really leaves a bad taste in your mouth, let alone like go back to the pristine wilderness, the fresh water, the ecological system that the world depends on so greatly. We can feel those impacts on a daily basis with climate change, and it is real. As much as people think it's fictitious, very much like COVID, climate change and COVID are two real things that we're faced with from a global context. So we're feeling the effects here in the north, the lack of, depending on which season we're in. Last year we had very little water. This year we're flooded, and it wasn't flooding to the point of where rivers were overdrawn, if you will. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of water. So every year there's different impacts happening that are somewhat natural, I would think, but there is a lot of that pollution used by carbon fuels. So I think when we look at going forward, it's about the machinery. They're leaking into the ground that they're dealing with. Taking a lot of that hydrocarbon out of the industry would be a great process to deal with it. I know that air travel through, like more like a blimp, if you will. I'm not sure if that's a proper term, but they have this aircrafts now that can haul, big machinery into a sensitive area without building roads. Because once you build those roads, go back to that where it now not only opens up that pristine wilderness for other interests, if you will, but also at the same time, it impacts our wildlife through hunting seasons. People are ripping through the country on these modern ATVs and side-by-sides with monster tracks on them. They're just ripping the land apart. And, you don't think too much about it, obviously, because of the fact we don't see it. But once everything is impacted by it, and it's the smallest, microism or whatever you want to call it in our environment to the biggest animal in our environment that are being impacted. The moose habitat, if you will, for instance, and all these different places. So the more that we can utilize technology to minimize the impact to the land. I mean, roads are probably the biggest, let alone the mining practice itself. And, whenever you have, we have a very short season here too. So things are expedited to the point where every day, every dollar, every minute is a dollar. So a lot of those practices, I think, are thrown to the wayside when you only got 2 more weeks left before the snow flies, and it changes your game plan. And you really need to make up for some of the costs and the losses that you've undertaken over the last couple of months. So yeah. I think the attitude changes when there's pressure being added upon, and we really have to really up the monitoring process, the environmental processes, to ensure that people are being accountable at the end of the day. So
absolutely. Peter, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about some of these topics, because I feel they're very important, even if they might be a little uncomfortable at times for certain people, because how do we create change if we're not talking about it and people don't know about these things, right? So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that all the communities that mining companies are working within are finding benefit. Environments are not being, the environment that they're in is not being left in disarray, for a lack of words. But I think these are very important topics to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about the youth within your communities. So when it comes to mining, obviously these days there's a negative connotation that's attached to mining. How do the youth within your own communities feel about the mining sector?
I don't think they really do, to tell you the honest truth. And, unfortunately, that's just a part of the education process that needs to happen. And even for me as a young person growing up in my own community, like I said, when we go into our traditional areas, all you could see is the negative impact. So when I was chief there, we did have a exploration company in there, a junior company, that we were able to come up with some good agreements where they would take some of our youth out to the projects to get this, to see the impacts and how the mining process is happening, and to start creating that, not only the excitement and the opportunities that can come from the mining sector, such as careers and the opportunities to even serve the mining company through expedition and providing goods and services, if you will. The more that we can do to ensure that the younger generation understand the benefits of having, you know, proper environmental practices, let alone proper environmental legislation, and to have up-to-date current mining legislation that not only guides the processes, but ensures that certain practices are being upheld. The more that I think the youth and the next generation understand that, they'll grow up with that with a less negative approach to it. Like I said, for me, I didn't really care about mining, but I do now. I definitely have a different appreciation, just having that relationship with the mining company. Obviously, everything that we utilize today, from the cell phone to the vehicle to pretty much everything, is created through the mining industry. And we have to ensure that, you know, one, we continue on in that progress, but at the same time that people understand the benefits that they do get from, you know, good mining practices, let alone the employment opportunities that, like I said, this younger generation, you know, like I said, go back to Selkirk First Nation with the Minto mine. There's people that have made a good living just by having the mine in their backyard, you know, 30 miles away, where they're able to have, like I said, very good wages and employment opportunities, but also they're able to get a career, because I think that mine life in particular is going on for 25 years. So for a young individual that's just getting into his adulthood, he or she can have, you know, a good 10 to 15, 20-year career in the mining industry if they wish to choose so. And there's so many aspects, from environmental monitoring, water monitoring, let alone heavy equipment operations, let alone being, you know, a supervisor and someone that is now leading the project. These are realities now that we are facing because we're building good agreements. Plus there's that right, like I said, I go back to those land claim agreements and self-government agreements that give us that authority and jurisdiction to have an ability to be a part of the mining industry, if you will, without having to, you know, beg, borrow, and steal just to have a piece of it, right? So
absolutely. And there's no reason why you guys should, because it's your community. So are schools and universities in your region encouraging the youth and women in general to be more involved in mining and teaching them about the best practices and how there are benefits?
yes, for sure. And there's been, you know, over the course of particularly the last 10 years, there's been a lot of great work done by, you know, entities and groups. We've now just established the first university in the north, which is Yukon University. So prior to that, we did have a college which had a mining innovation section of its college, which of the college, I should say, that allowed you know, individuals to come and get a very good snapshot of what the mining industry allows and entails for a career, but also to understand, more importantly, the practices and all the engagement processes that need to undertake to have such a project. We do now have a women in trades project, which looks at, and women in mining also, which is also obviously geared to the female, to the gender, a female gender, in order to not only encourage women to seek careers in the mining industry, but equally as important, to train women to be a part of, you know, to change the career path. Because we don't look at women on big machinery as being normal, unfortunately, because we have this bias, you know, naturally over the course of our history. So when we have construction or developments happening now, women are driving these big machinery and are excelling in these roles because of, you know, why not? I guess at the end of the day, right? We've always had this, you know, lack of understanding and appreciation for women in our society as it is. And now they're becoming leaders in the mining industry here in the north because of, now we've opened the opportunities, but equally as important as opening those mining opportunities, they're taking full advantage of those opportunities. They're not, you know, we're still struggling with social issues here that have been we've been impacted through government policy, through the Indian Act, through residential schools, through enfranchisement over the course of our history. Women, particularly First Nation women, let alone First Nation people, weren't even allowed to have a job until 1960s. So, the first claim in the territory during the big Klondike Gold Rush was found by a First Nation person, but they weren't even allowed to claim a claim. So it was claimed by another individual who was of non-First Nation ancestry, and the legend continues. But yet, at the end of the day, Skookum Jim is the man that was the first man in mining, if you will, when it comes to that. So we're changing the way it looks. We're looked upon, but I think women here in the territory have always been leaders. And particularly when it comes to our self-government and land claim arrangements, majority of the chiefs that sit at this table, not majority, but I should say a good number of them are women. So let alone that are leading their respective governments, let alone that are leading industries such as the mining industry as well. So
I love to see that progress. Speaking of Skookum Jim, you want to maybe tell us, there might be a lot of people that are watching this, especially our younger audience, that probably do not know about him. You want to maybe give us a summary on his history?
Well, he is probably one of the most infamous people in the territory because of not only his involvement in the gold rush, particularly in Skagway and Dyea and over the Chilkoot Trail. The Chilkoot Trail was one of the most populated ways of getting to the gold rush, if you will. Like, they came up through the Port of Alaska into Skagway, but what was known as Dyea back in the day. So there was actually a traditional First Nation village that was impacted by that development at the same time. So a lot of First Nation people were hired to be the mule to carry these pianos and people's belongings.
Pretty much everything, lumber.
Everything. Like, if you go to Dawson and you see the history there with, so many things that are not normal, if you will, let alone pictures and all, instruments, all these things.
Well, they were bringing the luxuries of daily life over with them into the bush, right?
Exactly. Over this mountain and over this treacherous, it's incredible the journey that they went on. But Skookum Jim was a man that could carry twice as much as anybody. So people look to him. If you had enough money, you can pay Skookum Jim. He could work twice as hard as any individual, let alone his immediate family that were there to support. So when you had Skookum Jim on your team, you knew your things were getting over the mountain in an expedited way, let alone you're getting, your bang for the buck, if you will. So along that process, he, along with his, there was other individuals such as George Black that were part of this movement that was going on. So Skookum Jim, along with this group, went to Dawson City to seek fame and fortune as well, because during that time was a very much, that's where you had to be. If you're going somewhere, is going to Dawson to make it rich, because people were getting the vision that the streets were paved with gold. Everybody's making a dime there. They're making their wealth. And but Skookum Jim in his own thinking, and we go to a traditional story of First Nations. So we're very connected to the land, connected to our spirituality, connected to our ways in doing. So there's a legend that goes with it, that the frog in our society and our ways of doing is a very special animal who brings you gifts. So there's a story that the Skookum Jim that morning, when he went down to the creek for water, seen this little frog there by the water, and usually we give them a little present, if you will, to give us the wealth back. So you honor him, or you honor that frog with a special, whether it may be a little ribbon or something that's special, right? That's a part of you. So the legend as it speaks, that frog is the one that gave him that shiny gold, that rock that was in the water. So seeing that exactly what they were looking for, he reported it back to his partners there, and the rest is history, as you will. But being a First Nation man, you're not allowed to have any interest. You weren't even allowed to work, for that matter. You weren't allowed to have legal support. If you needed to fight somebody in the court of law, you weren't allowed to hire a lawyer. There were so many things that First Nation people weren't allowed to do, including claim and stake a mine, or to stake a property. So Skookum Jim had to pass that opportunity on to, like, George Black and others, George Carmack, to
see it
for him to take the rightful place. But really, at the end of the day, Skookum Jim was the founder of the Gold Rush.
Seems like Skookum Jim and the Frog had mutual respect for each other, but the rest didn't.
That's right. But he did make his fame and fortune to a certain degree also, and then we look at Martha Black, who was his sister, I think, or I apologize, I might be getting that wrong. Either his sister or daughter that was very much a part of that. She was married to George Carmack, or to George Black. So she is one that looked upon and been honored now, and I should know my history. I apologize for that. But I think in 2017, she was honored by the Yukon community here as being like one of the first women to be honored in the mining community. So now I think there's an award that we honor women that are actively involved in the mining community here. And now we honor them with the Martha Black Award, just for their perseverance, let alone their continued effort to ensure that things are done the proper way, right? So, but there is a rich history there.
Honor in the back there.
Yeah, well, we honor, this is primarily for our land claim and self-government agreements. So we honor the men and women that have dedicated their lives for the betterment of our people today. And, it's something that the previous Grand Chief has honored, started, and I've continued to honor that process, because we really need to take the time and to not only reflect on our history and to honor our leaders and our ancestors, our elders that have given us and paved the way, if you will, because we lived in a very tough time when it comes to government's influence, the influence of resource development. If you go back to 1492 and Christopher Columbus, all those were based on economy, going globally to seek and destroy, if you will. Slavery was a big resource economy back in that day, and land. And so ever since the first contact with Christopher Columbus, we've never had the same privileges and honors that we have as Indigenous people to these lands as we did previous to contact. So now we've struggled with, like I said, we're still struggling with the impacts of the Indian Act, with enfranchisement, with residential school, these processes that government has impacted us with. And however, at the end of the day, self-government is our roadmap to reconciliation. It is our roadmap to our success. It's going to build prosperity for our people moving forward. And when you think about like my little nation that is only about 750 people, we have a plan in the 50 years to be billionaires. And really at the end of the day, that is based on good investments. And it's not only investing in our community and our people, but it's also investing in global economies and resource development and any opportunities that we can provide, that we can make a buck at. So I think today when we look going forward, the more that we can be exclusive to what we're trying to do and involve more people. And primarily my role today is to educate the general public and on our journey, that they look upon us more as, people that are here to make change, not just a burden on society. Because you look at, just the social errors through alcoholism and drug abuse. Unfortunately, our people represent a big majority of that today, and they're still struggling because of the lack of identity, which residential school is probably the biggest impact to our societies and here in Canada, let alone from North America. So,
yeah, I think people have now just only started being more open and being able to talk about, things that happened in the past to your people. I truly appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, sharing your knowledge from your people and your communities. Like I mentioned earlier, these are all important issues that we need to talk about openly to be able to bring about change and create that mutual respect between all our communities. So that's great that, we went through all of this. I want to thank Sean Kingsley, who's one of our colleagues here in Vancouver, because he made the introduction to you. We had a quick little chat and we were able to get this conversation going. So I do want to thank him. Also want to thank your assistant, Eliana, for helping to coordinate and set all of this up. Sean had shared with me your radio show.
yes,
So you also host a radio show on what network?
it's Shona FM, which is the First Nation radio station here in the territory, which also broadcasts into northern British Columbia. It could be picked up anywhere for that matter, but the main focus, go back in our history again, when we started to build the momentum of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow and the land claim self-government agreements, we developed these institutions such as Northern Native Broadcasting Yukon. So we felt if we're going to not only preserve our language, but also tell our story, we need mechanisms such as radio and television that are going to not only preserve it, but also help promote it into the future. So we have, NMBY, which is Shona FM, a local radio station here, has been around for many years, if you will, and upwards of 40 years now on broadcast, which helps support that community connection, if you will, but also allows a platform such as myself. And when I first came into this role, I'm a big lover of music to begin with, but I thought I could take this element from my role as Grand Chief and be able to have dialogue on the air. So the communities that not necessarily get all the bells and whistles all the time, or maybe have access to things such as newspapers. I mean, the internet today has changed a lot, but there's still a lot of people that live outside of that internet bubble and that rely still on radio as a form of communication. So I looked upon it as being a platform for me to not only promote what we are doing internally through the Council of Yukon First Nations and the leadership tables that we have established here in the territory, let alone the processes, but it gave me the opportunity now to interview particularly the premier of the territory, let alone industry, let alone entrepreneurs, community members that are doing great things in their community. So now I have this, bi-monthly radio show that I interview. Like I said, for instance, tomorrow I'll be interviewing the national chief and having a discussion because there's impacts happening around the world, let alone in our communities, where we're still suffering from racism primarily, and still government policies that are, restricting our opportunity to find, like I said, prosperity and success. So, but I'm also interviewing, like the child advocate office here in the territory. So there's a big, I blend a lot of it's a big spectrum of perspectives that I like to bring forward. And there's nobody else in the country, let alone the world, that from a Grand Chief elected official perspective, interviewing other elected officials live on air, and then cutting in and playing a little bit of Black Sabbath or AC/DC along the way. That I'm living my dream there. So it's a little bit of my own personal, I always wanted to be a DJ. So I'm living a little bit of my my aspirations at the same time. But at the same time, I think I'm delivering a show that is informative, especially during the COVID process. We've really ramped up during the COVID reality. We've ramped up the used to be once a month. Now I'm doing it twice a week, like I say. And we're really trying to promote responsible, positive broadcasting, because at the end of the day, people are already living in this world of fear, and social media, let alone the news on television, is really broadcasting and promoting, this sense of fear to our community. So I like to think that I'm promoting positivity, really, like I said, honoring people that are doing good work in our community, especially during COVID, as a small example, but at the same time, having good discussion about good things that are happening in the territory. So.
Yeah, I caught one episode of your show. I think you interviewed a student by the name of Graham, from pardon my ignorance, it's from the Champagne
and Ajax First Nations. Yeah, so
that's right.
He's a young student that's in Pearson College.
You had a nice mix of music and content in there that was informative, and talking to him about different stuff that's relatable. So I'm hoping that our audience that watches this wants to learn a lot more about what you guys do. So where can they go to find out more about the Council of Yukon First Nations? Are you guys on social media? I know you have a website, but I'll let our audience know where they can find more details on you guys.
Well, we do have a website, which is cyfn.ca, and we are just in the process of launching a brand new, fresh website, which is, for me and my role, I think is very important to have I want to have a place where people can go on a weekly basis, let alone our own people, to get up-to-date information, let alone for companies or people of interest, if you will, that are wanting to understand a little more of who we are as Yukon First Nations. So we do have our website, cyfn.ca. On that website, we do have a couple videos. There's a video section, there's the land claim video series, which CYFN along with NMBY, Shona FM, established during this negotiation process. So if you have, a short 3 hours, they're done in 1 hour segments, about 45 minutes, it really talks about our history of how the impacts from Gold Rush, the missionaries, the impacts of RCMP, and where we were going with government policy, to where, the final threshold was like, if we're not going to do anything about what our future is going to look like for our children, then we might as well just lie down and let people run over us, or we can take a stance and take our rightful place back in the community. So in our territory. So we have a very good video series on there that gives a very good explanation of those times back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and let alone the implementation. We also have, basically Google search will give you a lot of good information about Yukon First Nations and the respected communities that we that are here in the territory. Like I said, 11 out of the 14 nations are self-government today. And we're really in a different place when it comes to development, community, especially community development. You could see the communities that are prospering from having these arrangements with government, but also making good investments. And I'm going to be selfish and say rockthetalk.vip. You can go back and start to see the video or the interviews that I've had over the past year. I've had over 65 guests last season, season 4. So we just started season 5 and we're in our second show tomorrow. So rockthetalk.vip is a good place to go to get, to see the gems of these interviews, let alone some of the dialogue that I've had over the last year.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to add both links to the bottom of the show notes. Of course, CYFN.
Okay.
We'll make sure the Council of Yukon First Nations links on there, as well as Rock the Talk. Peter, I'm quite confident that we've covered a lot of the topics that are affecting the communities that we need to get out to the public. Is there anything that you want, a message that you'd like to send out to the audience watching when it comes to mining in Canada and the Yukon First Nations?
Yeah, just once again, it's just, I think here in the territory, I believe that, First Nations here in the territory just want to be a part of the process. And it's not to, restrict development. We're very proactive when it comes to development. And once again, it's just about the significance of building good relationships and taking the time. And when you start to push and shove your agenda, normally, regardless of whether it's with your significant partner or your kids, you never get the results you want even by applying that. So when you want to build business interest, let alone long-term relationship, if a mining is being proposed for 25 years, you'd really like to have 25 years of good relationship and prosperity along that way. So I can't say enough about building that relationship and coming and visiting the place where you're going to impact and having an open mind, not just something that you've developed through your own thinking or you've seen visuals. Like I said, we're still looked upon here, and the racial tones in this country are very evident when it comes to first peoples of this land, because they think that we already have this sense of entitlement, yet we've been disrupted in our histories from our own societies, our own laws, our own communal ways in doing our connection to the land, our spirituality to the land has been disrupted because of government policy in the last 200 years. So we are not savages. We are not dirty Indians. We are sophisticated, educated, and we have a wealth of opportunities to offer to companies. And when you have those opportunities to see that and to be engaged, I think the benefits are mutual. And when I think about Sean and my relationship with him, it actually started with his cousin, Mark Wong, who at the time was, I'm not going to mention companies, but he was working for a company and they were getting some bad advice from Yukon government at that point that they really didn't have to engage with the First Nation involved. So once we started to see the progression of this one company going down the wrong trail, we were quick to react. We brought our lawyer and our counsel to Vancouver. We met in an office in Vancouver with our lawyers, and we said, this is the way it's going to be. You're either going to be a part of the progress and the plan going forward, or you're going to deal with us in court. So right away, Sean's cousin, along with the company itself, changed the way they were doing things. To their to their part, a lot of it was just based on ignorance, not knowing any different or any better, right, at that point. So really, at the end of the day, we spent a little bit of money providing that education. And at the end of the day, it fostered and developed these, like I said, these youth incentives to take our youth out on the land. They were now giving back to our community through community investment. But at the same time, we were being proactive as a First Nation government in that relationship. But, unfortunately, we had to go to all that measure just to really to give them a good shot in the head to say, listen here, you're not doing the right thing. Yeah. But by having that engagement, it allowed us to have a very fruitful and beneficial relationship that was mutual on both sides. So really, at the end of the day, I owe a lot to that opportunity, because it gave me that, even myself, an education to believe in what was going on, I guess, and to see the benefits of mining in my community. So.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, we at the Canadian Securities Exchange, we totally appreciate your time, you sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate your people and what you guys do for the mining community and as a whole. To everybody watching, this is Peter Johnston. He is the Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations. And if you like this content, feel free to like and share it. This has been part of Mining Over Canada, highlighting the Northern Territories. And I'm Anil. Thank you.